"We built this company from nothing," my son said proudly on national television while his wife stood beside him in diamonds that probably cost more than my first car. I stared at the screen in silence, holding a grocery receipt in one hand and a bottle of generic blood pressure pills in the other. And for the first time in my life, I realized something terrible. Their luxury empire had not been built from nothing. It had been built from me. I'm Margaret Hale. I'm 71 years old, and until 6 months ago, I believed sacrifice was just part of motherhood. I believed all parents gave until there was nothing left. I believed children eventually remembered who stood behind them when life was hard. That night proved how wrong I had been. The television glowed across my small living room while rain tapped softly against the windows of my apartment in Des Moines. The local news station was running a special feature on successful entrepreneurs in the Midwest, and there they were. Ethan and Vanessa Hale, my son and daughter-in-law, smiling beneath bright studio lights inside their $40 million luxury real estate headquarters in Chicago. Vanessa wore a cream-colored designer suit with gold buttons. Ethan stood beside her in an expensive navy suit that looked tailored specifically for him. Behind them stretched marble floors, crystal chandeliers, and floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking the skyline. The reporter laughed warmly as she asked them how they had built such an impressive business in under 10 years. Ethan smiled the same smile he used to give me as a little boy whenever he wanted extra dessert. "Honestly," he said, slipping an arm around Vanessa, "we started with absolutely nothing." Vanessa nodded gracefully. "Just hard work, faith, and believing in ourselves." I don't know why those words hit me the way they did. Maybe it was because I had spent that same morning clipping coupons for canned soup. Maybe it was because my landlord had raised my rent another $80 that month. Or maybe it was because sitting behind Ethan on the polished walnut shelf in his office was a silver carriage clock I recognized instantly. My late husband's clock. Robert had sold part of his retirement portfolio 22 years ago to buy that clock as a graduation gift for Ethan after business school. I remembered the exact conversation because we argued about it for weeks afterward. "We can't afford this," I had whispered one night while balancing bills at the kitchen table. Robert only smiled tiredly and said, "It's an investment in our son." I looked closer at the television screen. Next to the clock sat a framed photo from Ethan's college graduation. Robert had his arm around him proudly while I stood beside them wearing the same navy dress I'd bought off a clearance rack at JCPenney, because tuition payments had drained nearly every dollar we had. Suddenly my chest tightened. Not from anger. From memory. Pieces of my life began quietly fitting together in ways they never had before. The second mortgage we took out when Ethan launched his first company. The retirement account Robert emptied after unexpected business setbacks. The forms Ethan once asked me to sign because he claimed his accountant needed temporary authorization during tax season. Back then I never questioned him. He was my son. And after Robert died 3 years ago, Ethan handled almost everything financial for me because grief made even simple paperwork feel overwhelming. On television, Vanessa laughed softly while showing the reporter their private rooftop garden. "People think success is glamorous," she said, "but they don't see the struggle behind it." Struggle. I glanced around my tiny apartment. The faucet in my kitchen leaked constantly because maintenance never came on time. My heater rattled every winter. I hadn't replaced my old Buick in 11 years because I couldn't justify the expense. Last Thanksgiving, I cut my medication pills in half to make them last until my Social Security check arrived. Yet somehow my son owned penthouses, luxury developments, and vacation homes in Aspen. The camera panned across their office one last time before the segment ended. But my eyes stayed fixed on something almost hidden near the edge of Ethan's desk. A framed certificate from Hale Capital Ventures. Dated September 14th. I stopped breathing for a moment because September 14th was the exact same month my retirement investment account suddenly disappeared from my online banking records years ago. I remember calling Ethan in confusion back then. "It's probably just restructuring paperwork, Mom," he'd assured me calmly. "I'll handle it." And I let him. Because mothers trust their children. The television moved on to weather forecasts, but I remained frozen on my couch long after the program ended. Outside, the rain kept falling steadily across the parking lot below my apartment window. I slowly reached for my old banking folder from the drawer beside the lamp. My hands trembled as I opened it. And for the first time in years, I began reading every page carefully. I barely slept that night. The rain stopped sometime after midnight, but the sound of dripping water from the gutters outside my apartment kept pulling me awake every hour. Around 4 in the morning, I finally gave up trying to sleep and shuffled into the kitchen wearing my old gray robe and wool socks that no longer matched. The apartment felt colder than usual, quiet in a way that reminded me too much of life after Robert died. I turned on the small light above the stove and filled the kettle with tap water that always tasted faintly metallic no matter how many filters I used. While the coffee brewed, I sat at my tiny kitchen table surrounded by overdue utility bills, pharmacy receipts, and the thick banking folder I had not touched in years. The edges of the papers smelled faintly like dust and old cardboard. Robert used to organize every financial record in neat stacks by year. After he passed away, I stopped looking at most of it. Grief has a strange way of making even simple tasks feel impossible. Some mornings, getting dressed felt like enough work for an entire day. Ethan understood that. Or at least I thought he did. For 3 years, I trusted him completely whenever money or paperwork came up. "You should not stress yourself out with all this financial stuff anymore, Mom," he used to say kindly. "Let me take care of it." At the time, his concern sounded loving, responsible. Now those memories felt different somehow. I opened another folder and stared at several retirement statements from nearly a decade earlier. Back then, Robert and I still owned our small colonial house outside Cedar Rapids. We were not wealthy people, but we were careful. Robert worked 40 years as an insurance adjuster. I spent most of my life as a school district accountant. We skipped vacations, drove used cars, packed lunches instead of eating out. Every dollar had purpose. We built our retirement slowly month after month, over decades of ordinary sacrifice. I still remember the first winter after Ethan graduated college. His startup failed within 18 months, and he showed up at our front door looking exhausted and embarrassed. Vanessa was still his girlfriend back then. She sat quietly beside him while he explained how investors had backed out unexpectedly. "I just need a little time to get things going again," Ethan had said softly. Robert looked at me across the dinner table that night after they left. "We can help him," he whispered. So we did. We refinanced the house. Then came another emergency 6 months later. Then another opportunity Ethan insisted would change everything. Every time he promised to pay us back once the business stabilized. I believed him because that is what mothers do. We believe the best version of our children even when reality quietly says otherwise. The kettle whistled sharply, pulling me back to the present. I poured coffee into my chipped blue mug and noticed my hands trembling slightly again. Outside my kitchen window, dawn slowly brightened the parking lot below. A maintenance truck crawled past piles of dirty snow near the dumpsters. Somewhere upstairs, a television turned on loudly. Ordinary sounds. Ordinary life. Yet something inside me no longer felt ordinary. I flipped deeper into the banking records until I found the year Robert got sick. That was when Ethan became even more involved in our finances. Hospital appointments exhausted me. Medical forms piled up constantly. One afternoon Ethan arrived carrying a stack of papers clipped neatly together. "Just temporary authorization forms," he explained while setting them on the dining room table beside Robert's medication bottles. "This will make it easier for me to help manage things while Dad focuses on treatment." I remember barely reading them before signing. Robert looked tired that day. Pale. Vanessa stood near the kitchen doorway silently watching everything unfold with her arms crossed neatly over her cream-colored coat. At the time I thought she looked supportive, sophisticated. Now, remembering the expression on her face made a strange heaviness settle into my stomach. I turned another page slowly and froze. There it was. A transfer amount large enough to change someone's entire future. The date matched exactly 3 weeks after those authorization forms were signed. My retirement account balance dropped almost overnight. Beneath the transaction summary sat a company name I had never noticed before. Hale Capital Ventures. For several minutes, I simply stared at the company name without moving. Hale Capital Ventures. The same name displayed proudly beneath Ethan's interview on television the night before. The same company journalists called one of the fastest-growing luxury development firms in the Midwest. My coffee had gone cold beside me, but I barely noticed. I kept reading the statement again and again, hoping I had misunderstood something. Maybe the money had been transferred temporarily. Maybe it had been invested safely on my behalf. Maybe there was still some reasonable explanation buried somewhere deeper in the paperwork. But every page I turned only tightened the knot in my chest. Large transfers. Authorization changes. Investment restructuring documents I did not remember approving. By 8:30 that morning, sunlight had fully filled the apartment, though the warmth never seemed to reach me. I pulled my old cardigan tighter around my shoulders and walked slowly into the bedroom where Robert's framed photograph still sat on the dresser beside a dried lavender candle I could never bring myself to throw away. He looked younger in that picture. Healthier. It had been taken during our 30th anniversary trip to Door County before life became hospitals, paperwork, and quiet exhaustion. Did you know? I whispered softly toward the photograph before feeling foolish immediately afterward. But the question stayed there anyway. Because suddenly memories I had ignored for years no longer felt harmless. They felt arranged, deliberate. Vanessa had always been polished in a way that intimidated me slightly. Even before Ethan married her, she carried herself like someone constantly performing for invisible cameras. Perfect hair. Perfect smile. Perfect manners that somehow never felt warm. At family dinners, she asked careful questions about savings accounts, property taxes, insurance policies, and investment planning with the casual confidence of someone gathering information without appearing to do so. Back then, I told myself she was simply financially smart. Robert was less convinced. One Christmas Eve after Ethan and Vanessa left our house, Robert stood at the kitchen sink rinsing wine glasses while snow fell softly outside. "That girl watches everything," he muttered quietly. I laughed at him at the time. "You are being paranoid," I said. "She is ambitious. That is all." Robert never argued further, but I remember the expression on his face now. Concern hidden beneath resignation. He loved Ethan too much to challenge him directly. We both did. Around noon, I drove to the bank branch across town because sitting alone with my thoughts had become unbearable. The heater in my old Buick squealed every time I turned left, and the passenger window no longer rolled down properly. At a red light, I glanced at the luxury SUV beside me and caught myself wondering if Ethan had ever noticed how old my car had become. Probably not. Successful people stop seeing struggle when it belongs to someone else. Inside the bank, everything smelled faintly like printer ink and carpet cleaner. A young teller with bright red nails smiled politely when I asked for copies of older account records. "Some of these go back almost 10 years, she explained kindly. "It may take a little while." "That is all right," I replied softly. "I have time." The words sounded heavier than I intended. While I waited, I sat near the lobby window watching people hurry past outside carrying coffees and briefcases and grocery bags. Ordinary lives. Ordinary worries. Young mother bounced a crying toddler gently against her shoulder while searching through her purse for car keys. An elderly man struggled slowly across the parking lot with a cane. Nobody around me knew that my entire understanding of my family was quietly collapsing one document at a time. Nearly 40 minutes later, the teller returned carrying a thick envelope. "There were a lot of transfer requests connected to these accounts," she said casually while sliding the papers toward me. "Looks like someone consolidated several retirement products under business investment management years ago." Business investment management. The phrase echoed strangely in my mind all the way home. That evening, I spread the new documents across my kitchen table carefully. Transfer after transfer appeared under Ethan's authorization access. Some amounts were small enough to avoid attention. Others were enormous. Then I found something that made my stomach drop completely. A signed approval form bearing my name in shaky cursive handwriting. Only it was not my handwriting at all. I sat frozen at the kitchen table while evening shadows slowly crept across the apartment walls. The forged signature stared back at me from the page like something alive. Whoever signed that document had tried to copy my handwriting carefully, but they missed small things only I would notice. The curve on the M in Margaret tilted too sharply. The tail of the T extended farther than mine ever did. It was close enough to fool a bank employee processing hundreds of forms every week. But it was not my signature. I knew that with absolute certainty. My chest felt strangely hollow as I reached for another document beneath it. Then another. More signatures. More authorizations. More transfers. By the time the clock above the stove read 7:15, I realized this had not happened once during a moment of confusion after Robert's illness. It had happened repeatedly over years. Carefully, quietly, systematically. I leaned back slowly in my chair and closed my eyes. Memories drifted through my mind in painful fragments. Ethan insisting on handling electronic banking passwords because technology stresses you out. Mom. Vanessa encouraging me to simplify my finances after Robert's death because you deserve peace at this age. The retirement statements that stopped arriving by mail because Ethan switched everything to paperless delivery for convenience. At the time, every explanation sounded reasonable. Loving even. That was the cruelest part. Betrayal never arrives looking ugly at first. Sometimes it arrives smiling politely while offering to help carry groceries. My phone buzzed suddenly against the table, startling me so badly I nearly dropped the papers. Ethan's name appeared across the screen. For a moment, I simply stared at it ringing in my hand. Then I answered. "Hey Mom," he said warmly. "Just checking in. How are you doing?" I looked around my tiny apartment. The flickering kitchen light. The cracked linoleum floor near the refrigerator. The overdue electric bill sitting beside my elbow. "I am all right," I answered quietly. "Just tired." "You sound exhausted," he replied immediately. "You really need to stop worrying so much about money all the time. Vanessa and I were actually talking about maybe helping you find a nicer senior community closer to Chicago." Senior community. The word settled heavily in my stomach. Not because assisted living itself offended me, but because of how casually he said it. As though my independence were already becoming inconvenient. "That is thoughtful," I said carefully. "But I am comfortable here." There was a small pause on the line. "Well," Ethan continued lightly, "you should think about your future, Mom. Maintaining everything alone gets harder at your age." At your age. I used to hear concern in phrases like that. Tonight I heard management. Control. I glanced down at the forged signature spread across the table in front of me. "Maybe," I said softly. "I will think about it." After we hung up, I remained still for several minutes. Then slowly, I opened the small wooden box beside the bookshelf where Robert kept important personal papers before he died. Most of it contained ordinary things. Insurance policies, old tax returns, warranty receipts for appliances we no longer owned. But near the bottom sat a sealed envelope, with my name written across the front in Robert's careful handwriting. Margaret. Private. My pulse quickened slightly as I opened it. Inside was a short handwritten note folded around a business card. "If you ever feel uncertain about anything financial after I am gone, call Daniel Brooks. Trust your instincts, not appearances." I read the sentence 3 times before looking at the card. Daniel Brooks. Financial attorney. Cedar Rapids. Suddenly I remembered him vaguely from years earlier. Quiet man. Gray hair. Expensive suits. He handled some of Robert's retirement planning before Ethan became involved in our finances. Why had Robert left this hidden away instead of simply telling me directly? Unless he had suspected something before he died. A cold heaviness spread slowly through my chest at the thought. Outside my apartment window, snow had begun falling again under the yellow parking lot lights. Soft. Silent. Beautiful from a distance. I picked up the phone beside me and stared at Daniel Brooks's number for a long time before finally dialing it. Daniel Brooks answered on the 4th ring with the cautious tone of someone interrupted late at night. His voice sounded older than I remembered. Slower. More careful around the edges. "This is Daniel Brooks," he said politely. For a moment I almost hung up. My hand tightened around the phone while snow drifted quietly outside my apartment window. Then I forced myself to speak. "Mr. Brooks, my name is Margaret Hale." Silence followed immediately. Not confusion. Recognition. I heard him exhale softly before answering. "Margaret," he said quietly. "I have wondered for years if you would ever call me." A chill moved slowly through my body at those words. I sat down carefully at the kitchen table again, surrounded by scattered bank statements and forged documents that suddenly felt even heavier than before. "You knew something was wrong," I whispered. Daniel paused for several seconds. "I knew enough to be concerned," he replied carefully. But your husband asked me not to interfere unless you came to me yourself. I closed my eyes briefly. Robert knew. Maybe not everything, but enough to worry. Enough to leave that envelope hidden away for me to find one day. Can we meet? I asked softly. Tomorrow morning, Daniel answered immediately. 9 o'clock. My office downtown. I barely slept again that night. Every time I closed my eyes, memories surfaced differently than before. Ethan standing beside Robert's hospital bed offering to manage bills. Vanessa reorganizing our filing cabinets after the funeral while speaking in that calm, efficient voice of hers. You should not burden yourself with all this paperwork anymore, Margaret. At the time, her help had felt comforting. Now I wondered how much she had already seen hidden inside those folders. By morning, the snowstorm had passed, leaving the city covered beneath a thin sheet of ice that glittered under pale winter sunlight. I dressed carefully in dark slacks and the navy wool coat Robert bought me nearly 15 years earlier during a department store clearance sale. The sleeves had become slightly worn at the cuffs, but I still kept it brushed clean every winter. Some people stop noticing old things after they lose value. I never did. Daniel's office occupied the second floor of a red brick building overlooking Cedar Rapids Courthouse Square. The waiting room smelled faintly like leather and coffee. Framed law degrees lined the walls beside photographs of fishing trips and grandchildren. Everything about the office felt stable, quiet, permanent. A young receptionist offered me tea while I waited. My hand shook slightly when I lifted the cup. Daniel opened his office door himself a few moments later. His hair was almost completely silver now, and thin reading glasses rested low on his nose. But his expression changed the moment he saw me. Not pity, regret. Margaret, he said gently. I am sorry. Those 3 words nearly broke something inside me. Because until then, part of me still hoped there was some misunderstanding hidden beneath all the paperwork. Some mistake that could explain everything away. But regret only exists when truth already does. Daniel closed the office door behind us and motioned for me to sit across from his desk. Then he removed a thick file folder from a locked cabinet without saying a word. Your husband came to me about 8 months before he passed away, Daniel explained carefully. He noticed irregularities connected to several retirement accounts and business transfers involving Ethan. My throat tightened instantly. Did Ethan steal from us? I asked quietly. Daniel folded his hands together for a moment before answering. Your son convinced Robert the money was temporary business leveraging tied to future returns. Robert wanted to believe him. The phrase landed painfully because I understood it completely. Parents do not stop wanting to trust their children simply because evidence says otherwise. Daniel slid several documents across the desk toward me. Corporate filings, investment records, transfer authorizations. At first, the amounts were relatively small, he continued. Then the transactions expanded significantly after Robert became ill. I stared down at the paperwork silently while Daniel's voice continued somewhere above the pounding in my ears. There is something else you need to understand, Margaret. Your retirement funds were not simply borrowed. They became foundational startup capital for Hale Capital Ventures. Foundational startup capital. Such clean professional words for something that suddenly felt deeply personal and ugly. Daniel looked at me carefully before speaking again. Without your money, their company likely would never have survived its first 2 years. I lowered my eyes slowly to the documents in front of me. Every luxury tower, every interview, every magazine cover, every polished speech about sacrifice and hard work. Built quietly on money, Robert and I spent 40 years saving. The hardest part was not the money. People assume betrayal becomes easier when numbers are involved because numbers feel cold and measurable. But sitting in Daniel Brooks's office that morning, I realized the real damage had nothing to do with retirement accounts or investment portfolios. It was the slow understanding that my son had watched me struggle for years while knowing exactly why I was struggling. That was the part one could not stop thinking about as I drove home through streets lined with dirty snowbanks and half-frozen sidewalks. Ethan knew about the nights I skipped dinner because groceries had become too expensive by the end of the month. He knew I delayed dental work for nearly 2 years because Medicare did not cover enough of the cost. He knew I still wore winter boots held together by glue near the soles because replacing them felt irresponsible on my fixed income. And through all of it he said nothing. By the time I reached my apartment complex, my chest felt heavy with a kind of exhaustion deeper than grief. Grief at least leaves room for love. This felt emptier somehow. Inside the apartment, I removed my coat slowly and noticed the blinking light on my answering machine. 2 missed messages. The first came from my pharmacy reminding me that one prescription refill remained overdue. The second was Vanessa. "Hi Margaret," she said brightly, her voice polished and cheerful as always. "Just wanted to remind you about dinner Saturday night. Ethan is inviting some investors over, and we would love for you to come. It would mean a lot to him." Investors. I stood quietly in the kitchen holding the machine playback button, while her words echoed softly through the room. Suddenly I understood why they still invited me occasionally to these formal dinners and company celebrations. I was not there as family. I was there as part of the mythology. The hardworking humble mother who sacrificed everything so her son could succeed. A living prop for their self-made image. I almost declined immediately. Instead, I surprised myself by picking up the phone and calling Vanessa back. She answered on the second ring. "Margaret," she said warmly, "I was hoping you would come Saturday." "I will be there," I replied calmly. There was a small pause, almost like relief. "Wonderful," she said quickly. "Oh, and wear something elegant if you can. There will be media people there. Wear something elegant if you can." I looked down at my faded sweater, and suddenly remembered another moment years earlier during Ethan's first major company gala in Chicago. Vanessa had taken me shopping for a dress because she insisted my usual clothing would not photograph well beside sponsors and executives. At the time I thought she was helping me feel included. Now I wondered if she had simply been managing appearances again. That night I sat alone at the kitchen table long after dark reviewing every document Daniel had given me. The deeper I looked, the clearer the pattern became. Small withdrawals during Robert's illness. Larger transfers after his death. Shell companies connected to Vanessa's consulting firm. Property investments routed through holding accounts I had never heard of. Everything carefully layered beneath complicated corporate language, designed to discourage questions. But one detail disturbed me more than the financial theft itself. Several transfers occurred during periods when Ethan knew I was behind on rent payments. One document showed a withdrawal large enough to cover 10 years of my living expenses processed only 2 weeks after I told Ethan I could not afford replacing my failing water heater. I remembered that phone call clearly now. "Things are tight for us too right now, Mom," Ethan had said sympathetically. "The market has been unpredictable." I almost laughed out loud remembering it. Tight for them. That same month, Vanessa posted photographs online from a luxury ski resort in Aspen wearing white fur-lined boots and diamond earrings. Around midnight, I walked quietly into my bedroom and opened the small cedar chest at the foot of the bed where I kept old family photographs. Ethan at 6 years old holding a fishing pole beside Robert at Lake Okoboji. Ethan in his graduation cap smiling proudly between us. Ethan dancing with me at his wedding, while Vanessa watched from across the ballroom in silk and pearls. I studied every photograph carefully, searching for the exact moment my son stopped seeing me as his mother and started seeing me as an available resource. But photographs only preserve appearances. They never capture the truth happening underneath. Saturday arrived gray and bitterly cold. Wind pushed loose snow across the sidewalks outside my apartment, while I stood in front of my bedroom mirror deciding what version of myself I wanted Ethan and Vanessa to see that night. For years I had shown them softness, patience, gratitude for whatever scraps of attention they offered between business trips and investor dinners. That woman no longer existed in quite the same way. I chose a dark green wool dress Robert once loved because he said it made my eyes look younger. The fabric still fit properly despite the years, though my hands trembled slightly while fastening the pearl earrings he gave me on our 25th anniversary. Before leaving, I placed Daniel's folder carefully inside my handbag beside a small notepad filled with dates, account numbers and observations I had quietly begun organizing over the past several days. The drive to Chicago took nearly 4 hours because of weather, giving me far too much time alone with my thoughts. I kept remembering small moments differently now. Ethan paying for dinner once and making a theatrical joke about supporting his retired mother in front of waiters. Vanessa encouraging me to move closer to them so they could better manage my needs. At the time those comments sounded caring. Now every word carried the faint aftertaste of ownership. Their penthouse occupied the top floor of a luxury tower overlooking Lake Michigan. Marble lobby floors reflected golden chandelier light while valets hurried guests inside from the cold. I parked my old Buick beside rows of sleek black sedans and luxury SUVs worth more than my yearly income. The doorman glanced briefly at my car before masking his expression politely. Inside the elevator, I caught my reflection in mirrored walls and realized something strange. I no longer felt embarrassed by my age or my modest clothes standing beside wealthy strangers. The embarrassment belonged somewhere else now. Vanessa greeted me personally at the penthouse entrance wearing an ivory cocktail dress and diamonds that flashed beneath recessed lighting every time she moved. "Margaret," she said brightly, air-kissing my cheek. "You look lovely." Her perfume smelled expensive and floral. Behind her stretched a home larger than the entire first floor of my apartment building. Floor-to-ceiling windows overlooked the frozen lake. Caterers carried trays of champagne through rooms filled with investors, journalists and politicians. Somewhere soft jazz music played beneath the steady hum of important conversations. "Everyone has been excited to meet Ethan's mother," Vanessa said while guiding me farther inside with careful fingertips against my arm. Ethan appeared moments later surrounded by 3 men in tailored suits. "Mom," he said warmly, kissing my cheek quickly before returning to business conversation almost immediately. "Glad you made it." Made it? As though I were a distant relative invited out of obligation, rather than the woman who spent 40 years helping build the foundation beneath his entire life. Throughout the evening, I observed quietly while servers floated past with crystal glasses and miniature crab cakes I recognized from magazines because I had certainly never purchased anything like them myself. Guests praised Ethan and Vanessa constantly. Incredible success story. True self-made entrepreneurs. Proof that hard work still matters in America. Each compliment landed differently now. Vanessa excelled at these gatherings. She moved through the penthouse effortlessly, laughing softly at exactly the right moments, touching elbows lightly during conversations, making every person feel important. But once you stop trusting someone, you begin noticing details hidden beneath charm. The way her smile disappeared instantly whenever she turned away from guests. The quick, sharp glances she exchanged with Ethan whenever financial topics surfaced unexpectedly. The careful way she monitored every interaction happening in the room. Near the bar area, I overheard 2 investors discussing the company's upcoming expansion into luxury retirement communities across the Midwest. "Massive profit margins," one man said approvingly. "Older people are sitting on trillions in untapped assets." The other laughed. "Exactly. Emotional generation. Easy to persuade if you package things as security and comfort." Something cold settled inside me hearing those words while Ethan stood nearby nodding thoughtfully. A little later, Vanessa approached carrying 2 champagne glasses. "You know," she said lightly while handing me one, "Ethan worries about you living alone. So far away. He says you resist change too much." I looked directly into her eyes for the first time that evening. "Do I?" I asked calmly. For a fraction of a second, something flickered across her face. Not guilt. Calculation. Then her polished smile returned immediately. "Well," she laughed softly, "sometimes older people hold on to things long after they should let go." I wrapped my fingers slowly around the stem of the champagne glass and smiled politely back at her. Because for the first time in years I understood exactly what she meant. The farther the evening went, the easier it became to see the invisible machinery beneath Ethan and Vanessa's polished world. Everything about the penthouse had been designed to communicate success. The soft lighting, the imported marble countertops, the art displayed carefully enough to appear expensive without looking desperate. Even the guests themselves felt selected like pieces of furniture. Wealthy investors, real estate developers, magazine editors, people who admired confidence more than honesty. Around 9 o'clock, Ethan tapped a spoon lightly against his champagne glass to gather everyone's attention. Conversations faded almost immediately. Vanessa moved gracefully beside him while photographers positioned themselves near the windows overlooking the frozen lake. "Thank you all for being here tonight," Ethan began warmly. "This year has been transformational for Hale Capital Ventures." Applause filled the room. Ethan smiled modestly in the practiced way successful men learn after years of interviews and fundraising dinners. People always ask how we built everything from the ground up, he continued. And honestly, the answer is resilience. More applause. Vanessa reached for his hand while cameras flashed softly around them. We took risks, she added smoothly. We believed in ourselves even when nobody else did. Nobody else. The words echoed strangely in my mind while I stood near the back of the room holding untouched champagne. I thought about Robert signing loan documents late at night while rubbing tired eyes after 12-hour workdays. I thought about our second mortgage. About retirement accounts emptied. Slowly over years. About cutting prescription pills in half while Ethan's company purchased luxury towers in Chicago and Miami. Nobody else believed in them. I lowered my eyes briefly because suddenly I understood something painful. They had rewritten the story so many times that perhaps they even believed it themselves now. One investor near me leaned toward another and whispered admiringly, "That is the thing about true entrepreneurs. They create wealth out of absolutely nothing." I almost smiled hearing that. Not because it was funny, because it was astonishing how easily people accept beautiful lies when expensive clothing tells them to. After the speech ended, guests gathered again in smaller conversation circles while servers refreshed drinks and desserts. Ethan disappeared toward the office area with several investors, leaving Vanessa greeting journalists near the piano. I moved quietly through the penthouse until I found the hallway leading toward Ethan's private office. The door stood slightly open. Inside, soft city light spilled across polished walnut shelves lined with awards and framed magazine covers celebrating Ethan's achievements. I stepped inside slowly. Robert's silver carriage clock still sat exactly where I had seen it during the television interview. Beside it rested another object I recognized instantly. A framed photograph of our old house in Cedar Rapids. The house Robert and I lost 3 years after refinancing it to help Ethan's business survive. Beneath the frame sat a small engraved plaque. Where sacrifice built vision. My breath caught sharply in my throat. Sacrifice built vision. Not love. Not family. Sacrifice. They knew exactly what they had done. Suddenly voices approached from the hallway outside. I stepped quietly farther into the office shadows before realizing the speakers were Ethan and Vanessa themselves. The retirement project investors are almost secured, Vanessa said softly. Once we close Milwaukee, we can push expansion into Arizona. Ethan sounded distracted. What about my mother? A brief silence followed. What about her? Vanessa replied calmly. She is getting older, Ethan. You cannot keep sending small checks forever. Small checks. I thought about the birthday card Ethan mailed last month containing $200 and a handwritten note reminding me not to spend it all in one place. I know, Ethan muttered quietly. I just do not want complications. Vanessa laughed softly under her breath. Complications disappear when people become dependent enough. The silence that followed felt enormous. Then Ethan spoke again in a voice I barely recognized anymore. Just make sure everything stays protected legally. Their footsteps faded farther down the hallway a moment later. I remained standing alone inside the office while Chicago lights shimmered silently beyond the glass windows. Something inside me changed completely then. Until that moment, part of me still carried grief. Still searched desperately for misunderstanding or guilt or traces of the son I once knew. But standing there in the office my retirement savings helped build, hearing my future discussed like a management problem to solve, the grief finally hardened into clarity. They were not protecting success. They were protecting ownership. And for the first time since discovering the truth, I no longer felt heartbroken. I felt calm. I left the penthouse just after midnight without saying goodbye to anyone. Snow drifted softly across the Chicago sidewalks while black luxury cars lined the curb outside the tower waiting for investors and executives wrapped in cashmere coats. My old Buick started reluctantly after the second turn of the key, the engine rattling harder than usual in the cold. For several minutes, I sat behind the steering wheel staring up at the glowing windows of Ethan's penthouse high above the city. Somewhere up there, guests were still drinking champagne and celebrating success built partly from the ruins of my retirement. Oddly enough, I did not cry. I had cried enough already during the years I thought life was simply becoming harder with age. What I felt now was something quieter. Something steadier. The following Monday morning, I met Daniel Brooks again. This time I carried no confusion into his office. Only documents. Notes. Timelines. I am ready, I told him calmly while placing the folder on his desk. Daniel studied me carefully over the top of his glasses. Margaret, he said cautiously, once we move forward with this, there is no going back to the relationship you had with your son. Relationship. The word barely felt accurate anymore. There is nothing left to go back to, I answered softly. Over the next several weeks, my life became strangely methodical. Every morning I woke before sunrise, made coffee, and organized evidence at my kitchen table, while snowstorms rolled through Iowa outside my apartment windows. Daniel hired forensic accountants who traced years of hidden transfers in shell corporations connected to Vanessa's consulting firms. The deeper they investigated, the uglier the picture became. Retirement funds redirected through layered accounts, forged authorizations, real estate purchases disguised as investment restructuring. Several transactions even carried electronic timestamps proving they were processed, while Robert was heavily medicated during cancer treatments. One afternoon Daniel slid a thick report across his conference table toward me. This is enough for civil fraud claims and financial recovery proceedings, he said quietly. I stared at the pages without touching them immediately. Will Ethan lose everything? I asked. Daniel hesitated carefully before answering. Possibly. Especially if investors realize the company foundation involved fraudulent capital sourcing. Fraudulent capital sourcing. Again, such clean professional language for betrayal ugly enough to hollow out an entire family. I nodded slowly. Then they should know the truth. The collapse began quietly. Investors pulled back first after legal notices froze several expansion projects connected to disputed capital origins. Then journalists started asking questions about internal investigations tied to Hale Capital Ventures. Vanessa attempted damage control online through carefully worded public statements about temporary accounting misunderstandings, but confidence disappears quickly once wealthy people fear losing money. Ethan called me repeatedly during those weeks. At first his messages sounded confused, then defensive, then angry. I listened to none of them. The first time I finally answered, his voice cracked immediately. Mom, what is happening? He demanded. Lawyers are freezing accounts. Investors are panicking. Daniel Brooks is accusing us of fraud. Interesting how quickly family language returned once consequences appeared. I sat quietly beside my apartment window watching snow melt slowly from the parking lot below. Did you ever plan to tell me the truth? I asked softly. Silence answered first. Then came the familiar businessman voice again. Controlled. Strategic. We always intended to pay everything back. I closed my eyes briefly because somehow that excuse hurt more than outright denial. As though my life savings were simply temporary inconvenience money borrowed from a woman too old to notice. You watched me struggle, I whispered. For years. Ethan exhaled sharply into the phone. You were never supposed to struggle like that. Never supposed to. Meaning he knew. All along he knew. After we hung up, I blocked his number and sat alone in silence for a very long time. 3 months later, I moved into a small coastal cottage outside Bar Harbor, Maine using recovered settlement funds Daniel helped secure legally. The house was modest. White shutters. Small kitchen. Narrow porch facing the water. Nothing about it looked impressive enough for magazines or investors. But every bill inside that home belonged honestly to me. Some mornings I still woke before dawn expecting grief to crush me again. Instead, I listened to waves rolling quietly against the rocky shoreline and realized peace sounds very different from luxury. Peace does not need chandeliers or skyline views or applause from strangers. Peace is knowing nobody is secretly building their future from the pieces of yours.